Hey everyone, today we're going to cover how to build a slatted wall and specifically how you go about designing one. Last week we covered the wall over here on my right, and in that wall it's a very static pattern with the same spacing throughout, which definitely creates a unique look. And in this video we're going to be covering a little bit different way of doing it. We didn't want there to be too much wood, and we thought that the 1.5 inch spacing looked very nice over there, but if we continued it onto this wall it might just be too much for the eyes. Therefore on this wall we're going to be changing up the spacing, and it's going to be an exponential growth of spacing with each slat. I think this is a really cool design, so stay tuned to learn how to do it.
I'm Bianca.
And I'm Grant.
And this is the Lake House Project.
Alright, so the first step in any project is to start with the design, and to visualize the design I use a program called SketchUp, which is made by Google and is a free 3D modeling software. As you can see, I've come up with a couple designs, and here is that first slatted wall that we did a couple videos back. This was basically to determine what spacing I liked and how much of the black I wanted to show versus the wood, and also to determine how many slats I would need. So then I started to mess around with the other wall, and as you can see I mocked it up, and this white part here is the stringer, and I used the yellow background just to create more contrast so I can see those wood slats. And I was just playing around with where I would need the slats and where the seams on the MDF are so that I can cover those up with some slats and incorporate them into the design. So after playing around with it for a little bit, I decided on this exponential growth type design where the distance between each slat increased as you moved from left to right. These black lines here that you can kind of see, there's one here and there's one a little bit to the right, those are the seams in those MDF, and so I was playing around with where I could cover those up with a slat and how I could make it look seamless with the design. So that's where the Excel came in. So the first column is gap number. This just represents the number gap that it is on the wall going from left to right. Then in column D we have the actual gap distance. This is the inner gap between each left and right board. Then in column H we have the dimension, and this is just the measurement off of the left side of the wall all the way to the right. And here I paid careful attention to make sure that slat number 11 and slat number 16 fell very close to or right on 51 and 100 inches, as those are where the seams are. So I played around with the function in order to make sure that those two worked perfectly. And the way that I did that was I knew that the first gap I wanted to be would be 1.5, as that is the gap on the other side of the wall. And then I wanted each gap to grow exponentially. So the way I did that was using a function where I added the previous gap, so in this case it would be 1.5 plus an input of 1.17, which I basically just trialed and errored to get the right amount. So for me it ended up being 1.17, but you can plug in any number that you want with your design. And I raised it to the power of the gap number divided by 7. Again, this is a little bit trial and error, but this is how it worked for me. It's a bit convoluted, but this is how it worked. And so basically each gap, so I'll just use this one as an example, this is 1.17 raised to the 7th divided by 7, or basically to the power of 1 plus 3.04. And as you can tell, the distance or the difference between each gap gets larger and larger, so it's an increasing rate with each gap. And so eventually I get to about 14 inches between each. So now let's go back to that SketchUp design to see what it looks like in real life. And so here's that final version. Again, I fully mocked it up, and that black part is the stringer of the staircase, and the gray background will be black in real life, but I used gray just for contrast here, so it's a little bit easier to see. But I mocked it up, and you can see that those lines that were previously there as the seams of the MDF are now gone, as those are covered up by the slats. So I think it's a really cool design, as well as super functional, and covers up those seams nicely, as well as looks really cool. And so I really like this angle here where you can see both the slats on the left being equal and then the slats on the right being this exponential pattern. So I think that's a really cool look. So anyway, now let's get to building it.
Alright, now before we start nailing up the boards going vertically, we're going to have to install a board here that will cover up the old subfloor, as well as create a positive stop for the boards to meet up with. So it'll go on like so. We just need to cut the end there so it can line up with the stringer. Using a scrap piece, I cut it to 46.5 degrees with a bit of trial and error, and I'll put it here on the stringer and then put my level on top. And as you can see, it's pretty much level here, so I'm going to go ahead and cut my actual piece to 46.5 degrees. so now before we install that piece, there's a little bit of a ledge here just from the old subfloor and the new rim joist of the staircase. It doesn't line up perfectly flush with this MDF, and so I cut a test piece that has a basically cutout so that I can fit the piece around this and make everything nice and flush. There's a bit of trial and error there, but that's why I used a scrap piece, and now I dialed it in and got everything set up on the table saw, so now I can run the actual piece through it, and then we can nail it in and finally get to start nailing our vertical boards. All right, so I just finished cutting our actual board. As you can see, I got that profile carved in there with the table saw, and now it fits over everything really nicely. I'll show you a quick mock-up, just like that. And you can see it sits flush up against the MDF and covers up the seam nicely. So I'm gonna make sure to put a level over it and make sure everything's nice and level, and then I will use my pin nailer to nail it into position. So we got a couple boards in, and we now found the most efficient way to install them, especially with the gap constantly changing with each board. Okay, so the first step is to cut a block to the exact size of the gap of the next board that you need. This will be used in between the boards so you can see exactly where the next board goes. Then we take a rough cut board and cut an angle at the top so it can go up against the stringer. Then we cut it to about 1 inch or 2 beyond the ledger, put it into position using our block, and then we know exactly where it lines up with this ledger board and make a mark. We then bring that back out to the miter saw and cut it to size. Then we bring it in here, fit it, make sure everything looks good, and then we nail it in place. Okay, so here's the last board that we just installed, and here's the seam between the MDF panels that we're trying to conceal. And just to make sure that we're on the right track and that we are going to make sure that we cover this, I have laid out the spacers for each gap. So this is the next gap, this represents the next board, this represents the next gap after that, and then this represents the second board. And as you can see, it does cover the seam. It's not exactly centered, but it doesn't really matter. As long as it covers it somewhat, we're fine. So now we know that the seam will be covered, we can keep moving forward confidently. Alright, so it's a new day and we're going to be starting on the upper right hand triangle. We finished the lower left hand yesterday, and we want to make sure that the boards align as if the stringer wasn't here. So it's a little bit hard to see, but I set up my laser and aligned it to the right edge of a board down there. And then I also have the laser shining up here, so now when we place this board, we know it's perfectly in line with the one beneath it. So here we have the hickory floor on the landing, and we couldn't go all the way up to the MDF, so there is a bit of a gap here, but you do want that for expansion and contraction. However, we also want to cover up some of these screws from the MDF. So we want to put a baseboard, and we're just going to use some cut off of the material that we already have for the slat wall, which is just 1.5 inches high. And we cut that to size, and then you can just slide it in like so. I think it looks really nice and really clean where the black ends into the oak.
And that's going to be a wrap on this project. I hope you guys enjoyed it and learned something along the way. I use SketchUp for most of my projects as I'm more of a visual learner, and it definitely helps clients visualize what they're going to be getting in the end. So if you guys want to learn a little bit more about SketchUp or want me to include those parts in more videos in the future, let me know in the comments down below. And don't you just love this view? I think it's so cool. It's kind of like an optical illusion. But anyway, check out this before and now after. We still have a little bit more progress to go on this first floor, but it's really coming together and I'm really proud of the progress that we've made so far. But anyway, thanks for watching and happy building. See you next week.